Our scripture reading this morning is from John chapter 21, verses 15 through 19, and it's found on the back of your bulletin if you'd like to follow along. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my lambs." A second time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Tend my sheep." He said to him a third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter felt hurt because he said to him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep. Very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you used to fasten your own belt and to go wherever you wished. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will fasten a belt around you and take you where you do not wish to go." He said this to indicate the kind of death by which he would glorify God. After this, he said to him, "Follow me." This is the word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
Let's bow our heads in prayer. Gracious Lord, for the grace that costs so dearly, we thank you. Let that be in these words of mine and in our hearts that are gathered here. We ask this in your Son's name. Amen. It doesn't take long, it doesn't take much television watching to find one of these commercials. It's one of those where the kids are there with the mom and dad. Mom and dad are the ones that own the company, and the kids are either singing a song or they're talking about the product or whatever. And it is natural for us to watch the kids. I don't want you. Next time one of those happens, I want you to watch the parent and see if you don't catch just a little bit of pride in that mom or dad. Now, granted, that may be the 932nd take for that commercial, and by then, all that pride is like long gone. But I guarantee around the first or second take, those parents were pretty proud. It's natural for us to take pride when our kids take notice of what we're doing and say they want to try and be part of that, want to try and be in that. Now, I don't know if any of those kids are going to follow in their parents' footsteps. Some of them will and some won't. I know that in this family and in this community there are farming families, and that vocation is passed from generation to generation. And sometimes it isn't. Sometimes what we pass along to our kids isn't exactly the vocation itself, but it's something else that's intrinsic in who we are and what we do. And when we see that in our kids, it's an amazing moment. Not necessarily passing on what the family business is, but the family values and the caring and the things that are truly important. What that child is saying is that what they found in you and found in that life with you is valued and valuable. And it's not just for parents and kids as well. It's for mentors. It's for teachers. It's for anybody who has had that impact and that contact with somebody else, and that they have looked up to you. And they've taken some valuable lesson, some part of your life, and they have taken that into their hearts and made it part of them as well. We feel a sense of pride in a moment where what we've done has mattered. This is what Jesus is asking his disciples. Specifically, he's drilling in on Peter at that moment. And it goes back to how we hold our mentors or our parents or those adults in our lives, those people that we look up to. If we hold them in high regard, we really do take a part of them into our hearts and in our lives. We want to model ourselves by what we learn from them and what we cherish about them. something that was it was kind of interesting to me. I guess I'm a Bible geek, but it's one of those moments that, going through seminary, I hadn't really kind of thought much about who wrote different parts of the Bible. And I always thought that, well, if somebody said Paul wrote it, then Paul wrote it, and that was fine. But in reality, scholars have kind of looked at the stuff that we kind of pass off as stuff that Paul has written. And there are several books in the New Testament that really, by looking deeply at some of the timing of some of the things that happen in those books, that really couldn't have been written by Paul at all. Ephesians was one that came to mind. I went looking for the list of those books last night, and that was one that kind of popped into my head because I've actually been to Ephesus and walked around those streets, and it was kind of cool to think, well, Paul was talking about this stuff, and it turns out not so much. They're actually called Deutero-Pauline or Pauline writings, and in that same school. And it's not a ripoff, it's not plagiarism, it's not anything other than someone who valued Paul's life and teaching and example and couldn't have valued him or honored him any better way than to have written that book as if from Paul's own hand and voice. The 25-cent seminary term for that is called pseudepigrapha. But it was one of the things that happened in that culture at that time. When you wrote in the name or under the name of your master, it was how you honored that person. Are we writing our lives like that? Writing our lives in the tone of Christ, and isn't that what we do when we carry the name Christian? When we say that we want to live and be like Jesus, aren't we doing that same kind of thing, that same honorific moment, that same way of honoring the Christ that came and lived and loved and died for us? Are we not doing the same thing that those biblical authors did so long ago? Can we live our lives so that we give honor to the Master? Now let's go back to this idea of inheriting the family business. I want to go back to that for just a moment because if Jesus had sent his disciples off to emulate what he was doing, and if the people around him did not need what those disciples were going to be offered, it'd be a little bit like handing off the family buggy whip business to your kids and saying, go for it, have a great life. But Jesus didn't do that. Because Jesus knew just how hungry the children of God truly were then, are now. How desperately hungry and thirsty we are for meaning and for hope and for joy in the midst of a world that can absolutely feel crummy, difficult beyond measure, harder than we could even imagine. If you think our lives now were difficult, step back into a first century Hebrew man or woman's life under the rule of Rome. We can barely imagine how difficult that was. People were hungry at that moment for hope, and quite frankly, just like we are now. This was the inheritance that Jesus gave to Peter and to the disciples and to us. This is the business that he offered to them, to feed my sheep. Now, just a moment about the image there about feeding the sheep. You know, when we think about feeding the sheep, I know people that have sheep today. In my circle of friends, I was never able to say that before until I came here. So I can't pretend to know what it's like to have sheep or to be the shepherd. But I do know that back then at that time, a shepherd's flock was literally the livelihood of that family, and they tended it and nurtured it and passed it along from generation to generation. It was what kept the family alive. It provided them with meat and food and sustenance. It gave them their clothing. It put shelter over their heads. It was how that family survived. For Jesus to say, "Feed my sheep," simply meant, I am giving you responsibility for the most important thing on the planet to me. Carry on in my name, in the grace that I have offered to you, and the lessons that I have given to you. What I have taught you, live that. Jesus in this moment names the best memorial, the best legacy. And Jesus knew the value of that message, and he wanted to make sure that the disciples and we understand. He knew that we would need to be fed in good and wholesome and life-giving ways. He also, even then, 2,000 years ago, Jesus knew our propensity to junk food. And I can't say that Jesus knew that McDonald's would pop up and become the thing, okay? But I will tell you that Jesus knew what spiritual junk food looked like. Because he'd lived with it and listened to it his entire life. He had listened to the messages of Pharisees who had taught one thing and lived absolutely another. He had looked around at the culture that was around him at that time and seen the self-serving, what passed for theology in those moments at that time in other cultures that were around him. He knew what Roman culture looked like and what other cultures in that Middle East felt like. People from different cultures passed through the land of Israel all the time at that moment. Jesus knew what junk food looked like. He knew that it left people still hungry, maybe satisfied for a moment, when they satisfied their own wants or their own needs or what was going on in their own little moment at that time. Jesus knew what it looked like when people's theology developed a me-only, self-centered look to it, because he saw what happened and spoke out against the Pharisees for doing exactly that. They're being so concerned about their own lives and comfort that they couldn't have cared less for the people around them. Into that culture, Jesus said, love God, love your neighbor, and in this you will be truly fed. So it turns out that the banquet that Jesus was offering wasn't in that self-serving, my appetizer only kind of life. It was when we feed others. That's when our hearts are truly fed. Don't you find it in your own life? When you do something for yourself, you feel kind of good for yourself, and that's fine for a while. And yeah, I get doing a little self-care is a good thing every once in a while. I get it. But when you do something for somebody else, doesn't that do something a whole lot better for your heart? I want to thank the people that have brought food over to Kim and I. You guys are awesome cooks. Man, you got a salad making deal down. It's just amazing. But I'll wager that every single one of you that brought something over to us, or have ever taken a casserole to a family in a moment of crisis or need, that at that moment you weren't just handing off a casserole, you felt God feed your soul in that moment as well.
Amen.
That's how we feed each other. That's how God feeds us. When it's not about us, when it's about somebody else. And along the way, we wind up with a banquet that we couldn't match anywhere.
Amen.
Now, I keep going back to this moment when Jesus, in the 14th chapter of John, said, I'm going to leave you, but after I'm gone, you guys are going to do absolutely bigger and better things than I ever could, because I'm not going to be here anymore, and it's going to be on you. Now, granted, pardon my paraphrase, but that's basically what he was saying. And haven't we? Haven't we fed thousands of people? Every time a disaster happens, people's hearts pour out. Donations pour out. And we look for ways that we can help. When a friend of ours is in need, can we ever find more ways to help? Can we find enough ways to help? We are doing what Jesus asked us to do. We are feeding those sheep. We are empowering and healing and growing hope on a massive scale. And if you ever want to see that happen, pay attention to the ads that the Red Cross puts in the news right after there's been a big disaster. The Red Cross, the Salvation Army, any of those organizations take that opportunity because they know that when disaster strikes, people want to help. We want to feed our brother and sister. Because anything less than that buys into this fearful idea, this theology of scarcity, that if we share from what we have, then we're going to run out, there won't be anything left for us. No. Christ calls us to embrace a theology of abundance and giving and caring, and in that we will find our hearts fed in ways that truly matter, even if we run out of the last can of green beans in our pantry. Our hearts will be full. But there's still more to do. Because there are still those that buy into that theology of scarcity, that idea that I've got to get mine and to heck with the rest of you guys. We're not done. We're certainly not over. Now, I'm not asking you to go out and feed the multitudes. That's not your job, unless that's your job. What I'm asking you to do this week, your homework for this week is simply this. God's going to put somebody in your path that's hungry. Whether they're hungry physically or hungry emotionally or hungry spiritually, God's going to put somebody like that in your path at some point or another. Now, I hope it'll be this week, and maybe not this week, maybe next. But at some point or another, there's enough hungry people out there, you're going to stumble into one of them. Keep your eyes open. Keep your heart open. And this is the cool thing about going to that moment in prayer. Because if we're praying in that moment, we're listening to what God's directing us to do. And God will tell you. You may have to ask the person for God to tell you how to do that. But maybe it's just going to be something as simple as, you look really troubled. Is there anything I can do to help? If we're open to God's leading and God's presence and God's wisdom at that moment, you'll know what to do. Maybe it's simply as good as offering. Maybe that's all that person needed to know, is that they're not alone in their journey. But along the way, hear God telling you, feed my sheep. Look around. Who's hungry? Feed them. Let's bow our heads in prayer. Gracious and loving God, we leave here with one task in mind. To be open to the person that we will see next who is hungry in body or in spirit or in soul. And in this, Lord, open our eyes, open our hearts, and open our hands that we might, in your name, feed them. In your Son's name we pray. Amen.